I'm John Dickerson here with new CBS News 2016 Battleground tracker results. Is CBS News Elections Director Anthony Salvanto. Anthony, let's start with the place we all like to start, the horse race. Where do things look in Iowa at the moment?
There's movement. So Donald Trump has gone back alone into the lead. He had been tied with Ben Carson last month. And the big movement here, though, is Ted Cruz, who now vaults into second place ahead of Ben Carson. Now, some of the usual groups that you'd look for in Iowa, Tea Party voters and evangelical voters. In both cases, Ted Cruz doing much better this month than he had last month. And of course, he's been courting both of those groups.
So is it that, or was there a Paris effect here? How much does Paris play into these new numbers?
I think a little bit. We asked people, has Paris had an effect on your vote? And about 4 in 10, which is a pretty sizable number for anybody to say something's had a direct effect, say that it did. I think it feels to me like Paris accelerated something that might have already been happening. Not only was Cruz courting some of those votes, but in last month's polling, we saw that he had room to move, as did Rubio. You know, what Paris does is it focuses a little bit on the commander-in-chief test, which we also asked. And we see that for Ted Cruz and for Donald Trump among his voters, they're both passing. Whereas for Ben Carson, his numbers on the commander-in-chief test a lot lower. So that may have really had something contributing to all of this.
I'm interested also in the commander-in-chief question where Ted Cruz versus Marco Rubio. If the conventional wisdom is right, and it ends up being a Cruz versus Rubio race, with Cruz representing the grassroots evangelical movement conservatives and Rubio representing everybody else, something more towards the middle, they're going to have a fight over who's commander-in-chief. Neither one of them has a particular heaping of experience as an executive. And so in the poll, it looks like Ted Cruz, well, you tell me what we found.
Well, Ted Cruz does better overall on the commander-in-chief test right now than does Marco Rubio. And in each state, Rubio is seen by more people as likely than not, and Cruz in very, very large numbers. But I think if you read a little deeper, the commander-in-chief test isn't just a what would you do with the military test. It's really an effectiveness test. Mm-hmm. You have to be seen as strong. You have to be able to carry out some kind of direction. So if you look at, and we ask each person's voters, do you believe that they could really do what they're saying? That's an effectiveness test. Now for Ted Cruz, 2/3 of his voters say that they believe he can. Similar numbers for Donald Trump, who has also gotten people to say that he will be effective. But comparatively, much lower for Ben Carson's voters. They're supporting him, but they're much more likely to say, well, he may not get done everything he says, but we're willing to give him a chance. And that effectiveness, I think, blends into those commander-in-chief numbers.
I wonder, too, if strength, what we'll see, and Karl Rove said he wasn't, voters don't know what they want, but you see both Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio kind of trying to out-macho the other. So Ted Cruz looked straight into the camera and said, Mr. President, if you're going to talk about me, do it to my face. Marco Rubio had a new ad out on Sunday saying this threat from ISIS is a clash of civilizations. There's no equivocating. Very strong on him is the strong answer to that.
What happened in Paris could happen here. There is no middle ground.
I think what they are assuming, it seems, is that Republican voters want strong rather than a nuanced, full understanding. In other words, they're not going into a competition with each other over who knows which obscure terrorist organization better than the other. Do you think that in that competition, they have any chance of competing with the actual strong man in this race, which is Donald Trump?
Well, they all do okay among their voters for that. But, look, as much as we try to make this analytical or even statistical at this time of year, something like this is emotional, and that strength plays to that emotion. And look, one of the good things about running for president as opposed to being president, we see this in every campaign, is that you have the benefit of being able to be more rhetorical, and you can say things that sound strong and play on that emotion, even if you don't actually have to go out and do them. But I will just add this quickly. ISIS, to this specific point, seems to have become an instant litmus test. And on that, 7 out of 10 voters in all of these states say that they must agree with the candidate on how to handle ISIS, and most of those voters also would favor ground troops. So to your question about what is the right response, well, the strong military response very clearly does seem to be something voters want.
Wow. Let's talk a little bit more, though, about Donald Trump before we go, which is he is this week, again, another series of comments which may or may not have hurt him. There's a lot of kerfuffle about his comments about perhaps having a list of Muslims, surveillance in mosques. There seems to be a finding in here which would explain why he can say basically whatever he wants and it doesn't hurt him.
Yeah, we asked Trump supporters, what is your favorite thing about Donald Trump? And the number one answer was, he says things others are afraid to say. And that outpaced even things like he's not a typical politician. So on that specific point, every time you hear a pundit come out and say, well, you know, no politician could possibly get away with saying that, well, Donald Trump's voters are saying exactly. And that's what they like about him. So to that point, he may have, you know, an okay stance there with his specific group.
It's a way in which those of us who covered this race may have Donald Trump exactly backwards. In other words, the first things he said that people thought, I mean, presumably some of us have learned, and I'm talking about myself here, since his first comments about this kind of reversal of normal politics. But it seems to sustain and endure even this many months into the race. All right, before we go, let's take a look at New Hampshire and South Carolina. First of all, New Hampshire, what's the race look like there?
New Hampshire still has Donald Trump up by a wide margin. Now, his advantage there is that when he draws from a lot of independents, they are more numerous in New Hampshire. They can vote in that primary, so he does well with them. He actually does well across the board there, but there's fewer evangelical voters in New Hampshire than there are in Iowa, and that's something to watch as we go forward. It's just a very different electorate. South Carolina, he also is up by a wide margin, but the movement here is also interesting. We had seen last month that both Cruz and Rubio seemed to have room to grow. They were acceptable, and in both cases, in New Hampshire, Marco Rubio has just about doubled his support. Ted Cruz has also gotten a bump, and in South Carolina, Marco Rubio, again, has moved from last month. He's up from there, and so is Ted Cruz. So capitalizing a little bit on some of that room to grow, and in both cases, a little bit at the expense of Ben Carson.
Yeah, if you see this as the Rubio-Cruz race, you could easily imagine a good day in Iowa for Cruz, a good day in New Hampshire for Rubio, and then South Carolina becomes the tiebreaker.
And you know, it's so interesting. We do all of this and all these polls, and sometimes we forget just how many people in each of those states tell us that they don't make up their minds until the last week. So to the extent that this is unsettled, not just in one state, but across the board, well, that's what makes it fun.
Final thing that makes it fun is creative poll questions. Tell us about who people would like to invite to Thanksgiving dinner.
Well, so we asked that, and the number one answer for Republicans was Ben Carson. But when we asked it, we allowed folks to invite as many people as they want. And some, predictably not many, as you might expect Republicans inviting Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders, but about 1 in 10 did too. So you get Ben Carson gets invited, Donald Trump gets invited, Ted Cruz gets invited. Look, on a serious side, sometimes pollsters use questions like this as kind of a proxy for who do you like. Mm-hmm. And for Ben Carson, he is well liked, even if he's not as widely seen as passing that commander-in-chief test, even if they're not necessarily voting for him. But on a fun sense, who would you have over? You know, my favorite part of this were the about 1 in 10 Republicans who would have invited everybody. That to me reminds me of, you know, my big Italian family dinner where everybody's yelling at each other. So that that could be a lot of fun.
Either that or Republicans who live in exurbs and have enormous houses that can accommodate them all. Anthony Salvanto, thanks for being with us.
Thanks, John.